As Jinwoo looked upon the vast sea of trees that spread endlessly before him, he found himself in a place devoid of any other humans. A sanctuary of silence broken only by the rustling leaves. Standing tall amidst the natural expanse was a grand white stone castle that seemed to dominate the area with its sheer size. This castle, an imposing edifice, stretched across the landscape in both width and height, leaving Jinwoo to question the purpose behind its construction. He summoned Baru, who promptly appeared by Jinwoo's side, dropping to his knees in complete deference. At Jinwoo's command, Baru pressed his forehead to the ground, demonstrating his absolute obedience. Jinwoo studied the castle, questioning its suitability. It seemed almost excessively grand for him, and he wondered aloud if it was truly meant to be his residence. Baru, ever respectful, explained that he believed nothing less would do for his liege. Jinwoo's gaze drawn to a flag fluttering proudly atop the structure. Its presence struck him as unnecessary, and a sudden frustration rose within him. At that moment, Bellion joined them, positioning himself humbly beside Baru, as if sharing in the respect and reverence for their monarch. Jinwoo found himself momentarily speechless. Shifting his thoughts, he questioned Bellion about what would happen if he, their monarch, were to die. Bellion explained solemnly that the lives of all the Shadow Soldiers were tied to his own, and the moment Jinwoo's life ended, so would theirs. Jinwoo recognized that the greatest strength of his Shadow Army lay in their unwavering loyalty, an advantage that bound their very existence to his. Yet, as he pondered this strength, he saw the other side. The absolute nature of their bond could be a vulnerability, one his enemies might exploit to gain power over him. Jinwoo realized that his soldiers' allegiance was both a formidable asset and a potential weakness. This unwavering loyalty was like two sides of a coin, both empowering him and binding his fate with theirs. Just then, Igris, another faithful knight in the Shadow Army, voiced his concern. With straightforward honesty, Igris admitted that they would be at a significant disadvantage in an all-out war against their foes. Jinwoo listened intently, knowing his army's limitations. He turned to Bellion, seeking a realistic assessment of their chances. Bellion estimated that the enemy's forces would likely outnumber them 100-fold, an overwhelming advantage that would place his Shadow Army at a distinct disadvantage. Jinwoo's expression grew grim as he calculated the odds, realizing that they would be up against an army of no less than 10 million soldiers. The urgent call to run as far as you can echoed across the globe, a warning that mobilized countless people. Panic and uncertainty spread rapidly as many began to flee, heeding Jinwoo's warning of an impending threat. Yet, as the numbers of those seeking safety grew, opposition to this message also began to rise. Not everyone placed their trust in Jinwoo's words. Some doubted his intentions, questioning the credibility of such a drastic warning. Among the skeptics was Canada's S-rank hunter, Jay Mills. While he didn't have a direct line to Jinwoo, he openly scoffed at the idea of fleeing. If he had the opportunity, Mills would have dismissed Jinwoo's warning as mere scare tactics. He believed that Jinwoo was attempting to monopolize the gates, using fear to claim them all for himself. In Mills's view, Jinwoo's warnings were nothing more than exaggerated threats, and he voiced his defiance boldly, confident that Jinwoo's words would not intimidate him. In the public eye, the debate intensified. News channels discussed the growing division, with commentators and panelists debating Jinwoo's motives. Some argued that as one of the world's greatest hunters, Jinwoo's warning deserved consideration, while others remained wary, hesitant to take his words at face value. At the Korean Hunter Association, Jim Chul watched these developments closely. Reports indicated that hunters were gathering in Canada, rallying under Jay Mills' leadership. The movement had even attracted powerful hunters from other nations, uniting them in a shared goal to challenge the gates on their terms. Jim Chul, concerned about the implications of this gathering, reported the situation to Jinwoo, who understood the gravity of what was unfolding. Jinwoo, however, remained focused on his plan. He knew that confronting all 8 enemy armies simultaneously was impossible. His priority was to eliminate the threats closest to Korea, especially those that posed a danger to his family. Strategizing carefully, Jinwoo decided that his next step would be to head to China, where he could confront the nearby forces first and secure the region around his homeland. As Jinwoo prepared to face the upcoming battles, he recognized that time could be on his side. The longer the conflict stretched, the greater his chances of leading his Shadow Army to victory. Though the path ahead was filled with risks, he was resolved to fight, knowing each step was crucial in the war against the monarchs. Jinwoo arrived in China, his mind prepared for the mission ahead. He had been told that government officials would be there to greet him, but instead, he was met by the renowned Chinese hunter, Liu Zhigeng. Liu had decided to welcome Jinwoo personally, sparing him from the formalities the officials had planned. As Jinwoo glanced around, he immediately noticed a massive gate looming in the distance, so immense that it was visible visible from the airport itself. This colossal structure seemed to stretch across the sky, its dark presence dominating the landscape. Liu confirmed that this was the newly appeared gate that had drawn worldwide attention, a portal of unprecedented scale and threat. Leading Jinwoo outside, Liu displayed a wide grin as he introduced him to the assembled forces. Gathered below the ominous gate stood an elite army of Chinese hunters numbering over 100,000. Jinwoo took in the sight, both surprised and impressed by the sheer scale of the force assembled here. Liu couldn't hide his pride as he showcased his country's forces, emphasizing that this was no ordinary gathering. The army was not only vast in number, but also composed of highly skilled individuals, each prepared for the battle that lay ahead. Liu checked his watch, feeling the anticipation build as the moment drew closer. As he looked on, Jinwoo raised his hand, summoning his shadow soldiers with a simple command. In response, an intense rush of power filled the air, and in an instant, the shadows materialized around him. The sheer presence of Jinwoo's soldiers was overwhelming. A chilling energy rippled through the ranks, heavy and oppressive, pressing down on the surrounding hunters. Liu, stunned by the sight, couldn't help but recognize that Jinwoo was operating on an entirely different level. The thought of these fearsome beings descending upon the battlefield seemed impossible, almost surreal. Liu then turned to Jinwoo, marveling at the army of shadow creatures surrounding him. The sight was both awe-inspiring and unsettling, as Liu realized the vast power Jinwoo commanded. Meanwhile, Baru grew irritated, claiming his rightful place at Jinwoo's left side. Jinwoo quickly calmed him with a slight nudge, silently reminding Baru that Liu was their ally. Liu was taken aback as he observed Jinwoo's casual interaction with the shadows, surprised to see Jinwoo could communicate with his soldiers so naturally. Before he could dwell further on this thought, a panicked cry rang out from one of the hunters within the gathered forces. The gate was opening. As the gate slowly opened, Jinwoo's eyes narrowed with a sharpened focus. The hunters around him felt their chests tighten, holding their breath in anticipation of what might emerge. Yet moments passed and nothing came forth. The silence only heightened the tension, filling the air with a sense of unease. Standing beside Jinwoo, Bellion observed the gate carefully, sensing the void beyond it. There was something unsettling about the emptiness. Bellion expressed his thoughts, noting that he couldn't detect any presences from within the gate. Jinwoo's mind raced, his instincts screaming that something was wrong. A creeping sense of dread settled over him. Desperate to confirm his suspicion, Jinwoo called out to Bellion, asking about the status of the other locations around the world. Bellion relayed that the other shadow soldiers stationed near those gates had reported similar silence. No sign of any forces lying in wait. Jinwoo's expression grew more intense, realizing that something far larger than anticipated was unfolding. He thought back over his previous assumptions, piecing together what he had missed. His heart sank with a sudden grim realization. He had made a critical error. Jinwoo had believed that the enemies had divided their forces among the various gates scattered across the globe, yet the reality was far worse. They had likely amassed all their forces in a single gate, strategically placed as far from him as possible. Around the same time, in Canada, Jay Mills stood firmly among his fellow hunters, feeling a sense of pride that they hadn't yielded to fear. While the rest of the world seemed to rely solely on the warnings of Hunter Sung Jinwoo, Mills held his ground, determined to protect his country without placing all faith in a single man. Nearby, civilians rallied with placards, their voices rising in unison, shouting words of determination and courage. Their signs carried bold messages. We will not give up on Canada, and our hunters will protect us and our land. They were ready to face whatever emerged from the colossal gate, confident that they would win against any threat, no matter how fearsome. Mills turned his gaze to the gate above, feeling a surge of confidence as the enormous portal began to open. But just like in other locations, no creatures emerged. Confused, the hunters exchanged uncertain glances, murmuring among themselves. Doubts began to surface. Had Jinwoo overstated the threat? Then, breaking the silence, a single figure descended slowly from the gate. At first, it seemed like a lone humanoid creature, but as Mills took a closer look, he realized it wasn't a beast, it was a man. The stranger had dark red hair and a rugged beard, his armor crafted in gleaming silver and deep red, elegant and imposing, covering him completely. With a calm, piercing gaze, the armored man approached Jay Mills, studying him with an intense look. His question cut through the tense silence, asking Jay if he was the ruler of this place. Jay, stunned by the appearance of this man, quickly recognized that this was no demonic being beast as he had expected. As the mysterious figure descended, the hunters around J. Mills began chattering among themselves, analyzing the situation. They noted that there was nothing entirely shocking about seeing a demonic beast in armor. Many had already accepted that these creatures were not only capable of crafting their own gear, but also lived by a complex social order, using an ancient runic alphabet to communicate. Some hunters theorized that, given their intelligence, it wasn't a stretch to think they might eventually try to communicate directly with humans, perhaps even in their language. Hearing this, J. Mills couldn't suppress a wide grin. The thought of humans and beasts exchanging words was thrilling to him. Confident in his insight, he felt sure that he'd finally uncovered the mystery behind Sung Jinwoo's power. In his mind, it made perfect sense. Jinwoo had likely gained control over the creatures from the first gate by speaking to them, securing their loyalty by establishing himself as their king. For Jay, this was the true key to commanding these monstrous soldiers. Puffing up with pride, Jay stepped forward and questioned him, "What if I am the king?" The red-haired figure, however, was unimpressed. He cast a sharp glance over Jay, and the surrounding hunters declared that the true person he sought was not here. Back in China, Jinwoo grew restless, trying to understand the situation in Canada. The colossal gate there weighed heavily on his mind, and he needed confirmation of what was happening. He asked the hunter in charge of communications to reach out, but when delays persisted, Jinwoo's patience wore thin. Determined, he pulled out his own phone and quickly dialed Special Agent Adam White. On the other end, Adam answered promptly, respectful and ready to assist. Jinwoo cut straight to the point, asking if Adam could give him any details about the situation near Canada's gate. But before Adam could fully respond, Jinwoo's keen hearing picked up faint cheering in the background, enough to spark a deep suspicion within him. Something wasn't right. Realizing the implications, Jinwoo's tone grew sharper as he asked Adam for his exact location. Adam replied honestly, revealing that he and several agents were stationed directly at Canada's colossal gate. Jinwoo's frustration rose instantly. Why would they place themselves in such a dangerous situation? Adam explained that, faced with the tension surrounding the Canadian gate, he and numerous US agents felt compelled to be on site, actively monitoring the area. Jinwoo's mind raced as he grappled with the seriousness of the situation. Despite his repeated warnings, it was clear that many didn't fully grasp the threat they were up against. He pressed Adam urgently, asking if there had been any recent activity at Canada's colossal gate. Adam replied that everything remained quiet, adding that the gate, like the others, appeared empty. Jinwoo felt a brief sense of relief, thinking maybe there was still time to prevent the worst. But Adam's tone shifted suddenly. Jinwoo's spine tingled as he heard the agent's shaken voice say that something, or rather someone, was emerging from the gate. Adam sounded baffled, describing the figure as a human stepping out of the ominous portal. In a strained, urgent tone, he told Adam to find a car or anything that could help him get away, to run without looking back. Before Adam could respond fully, a sudden, violent explosion ripped through the phone connection, leaving Jinwoo cold with dread. His voice wavered as he called out to Adam, trying to understand what was happening. Adam's stunned voice returned, describing the horrifying scene around him. The top-ranking hunters, powerful and esteemed, had turned to ashes in mere seconds. Their bodies continued to burn, smoldering in a sight too overwhelming to believe. Realizing the danger, Jinwoo shouted to Adam with a fierce urgency, begging him to flee while he still had the chance to escape this nightmare unfolding near the gate. Adam stared in horror as countless dragons and beasts descended from the sky. The scene was beyond anything he had imagined, an endless swarm of demonic creatures, all converging in one place. Overwhelmed, he struggled to comprehend how such a force could exist. Jinwoo, sensing the urgency, knew he had one chance to save Adam. Determined, he focused on the shadow soldier he had placed on Adam, deciding to take control despite the risk. Acting quickly, the High Orc shadow soldier reached out, grabbing Adam by the wrist. It prepared to teleport them away from the devastation, but suddenly, a chilling presence appeared behind them. A middle-aged man with reptilian eyes glared at the shadow, his stare filled with dark power. The man's sinister energy pulsed through the air, paralyzing Adam with fear. Before they could escape, the man bared his teeth and charged a powerful attack, filling his mouth with blazing energy. In an instant, a torrent of flame erupted from the man's mouth. The fire consumed the High Orc shadow soldier in an instant, disintegrating it into nothingness. Adam's scream echoed, swallowed by the blaze, and Jinwoo felt the shadow connection severed, leaving only silence and a cold, hollow dread. Jinwoo clenched his jaw, frustration and regret boiling within him. He realized now that he had underestimated his opponents. With full knowledge of the Shadow Army's strengths, they had crafted a clever strategy to counter him. Instead of dividing their forces across multiple gates, they had lured him into a trap by focusing their entire army at the gate furthest from him, making it appear as if they would follow their original plan. 8 gates had been opened, but only one held their real threat, a maneuver to sidestep his advantage. He understood now that his own plan had crumbled. Even if he rushed to Canada, he'd face an immediate, overwhelming confrontation, a full-scale war with no chance to slow things down or strategize further. Jinwoo felt the weight of this miscalculation. His effort to buy time had vanished in an instant. Liu Zhigang, sensing something was very wrong, approached Jinwoo cautiously, his voice hesitant as he called out to him. Meanwhile, the hunter responsible for communications stumbled toward them, his face ashen, as if he'd witnessed something horrific. He stammered, trying to form words, his shock evident in his pallor, but Jinwoo didn't need him to finish. A Dragon King stood amidst the ashes, surveying the destruction with a dark satisfaction. Closing his eyes, he lifted his arms, embracing the essence of freedom he had longed for. The sound of heartbeats, of terrified screams, and of creatures being reduced to nothing filled the air, a twisted symphony that brought him immense delight. With a thunderous impact, ancient dragons landed around him, each one exuding a raw, deadly power. 2 monarchs joined him, their presence intensifying the atmosphere. The Dragon King's voice echoed with authority and fervor as he declared the purpose that drove their very existence: to destroy, to consume, and to leave nothing in their wake. At his command, the Legion of Dragons sprang into action. Hundreds of massive, fearsome creatures soared overhead, filling the skies and unleashing a torrent of fire upon everything below. The searing flames spread across the land like waves, consuming everything they touched in a relentless inferno. In the dimly lit office, the muted television flickered, occasionally showing images of magical beasts rampaging across the screen. David Brandon watched in a daze, his mind clouded by the effects of alcohol. He understood why the networks kept replaying the footage. It was a grim reminder of the unstoppable force humanity now faced. Alone in the director's office, David's thoughts spiraled, envisioning the fate of everyone stationed at the colossal gate. The hunters, agents, reporters, they were likely gone, swallowed by an army of dragons and swarms of monstrous creatures. Humanity stood no chance against such overwhelming numbers, and David realized with a sinking feeling that Sung Jinwoo's advice to stay clear of the gates was a final warning that few had heeded. Consumed by the certainty of impending doom, David sank deeper into despair, muttering to himself that it was only a matter of time before this monstrous wave reached the United States. In his mind, the world was already lost, and he was simply waiting for the inevitable. Then, unexpectedly, the shadows in his office began to shift. David felt a hand on his shoulder, snapping him out of his dark thoughts. He turned, his eyes widening in disbelief as he recognized the figure standing behind him. It was Sung Jinwoo. Jinwoo's presence was steady, his expression purposeful. He stated his reason for the visit. He was searching for something specific. Jinwoo reiterated his request calmly, asking David Brandon for the runestone that Kamish had left behind. David, initially startled, quickly grasped the weight of Jinwoo's visit. Though he tried to explain that Kamish's runestones were technically under the control of the Hunter's Bureau, a realization dawned on him. What did bureaucratic rules even matter now? Faced with the looming destruction of the United States, and perhaps humanity itself, protocols and formalities felt trivial. Collecting himself, David admitted that he was still somewhat intoxicated, then agreed to hand over the runestone. But curiosity gnawed at him, and he questioned Jinwoo's intentions. Jinwoo responded resolutely, stating that he planned to use the stone as a means to launch a counterattack against the monstrous invasion. Together, they moved swiftly to the 9th underground level of the Hunter Command Center headquarters, where the precious runestones were stored. Along the way, David couldn't help but reflect on Jinwoo's previous statements about the powerful entities, the rulers, who had sent these demonic beasts to Earth. As they approached the tempered glass display case holding the runestone, David voiced his thoughts, wondering what purpose these stones truly served if the rulers were behind everything. Jinwoo offered an answer, explaining that the runestones were essentially tools the rulers had given humanity, meant to assist in hunting down demonic beasts. The rulers' goal was to encourage intense battles between humans and beasts, ensuring that mana would take root on Earth. To them, the sacrifices of humans were secondary, incidental outcomes rather than a primary objective. When a beast perished, its powers became sealed within these stones, a mechanism designed by the rulers to strengthen humans against their monstrous foes. David processed this new understanding, now fully aware that humanity was caught in a deadly game orchestrated by beings far beyond their comprehension. The significance of the runestone before them felt magnified. It was not just a relic, but a weapon in humanity's struggle for survival. David asked Jinwoo a question filled with doubt and hope, wondering if these runestones could truly make a difference against the overwhelming enemy. Jinwoo, resolute, replied that he would have to try. Then he asked David for another favor. Shortly after, David led Jinwoo to an apartment building near the Hunter Command Center. Inside, they found Norma Selner, a woman with the rare ability to see into the future. When she saw Jinwoo, she gasped, noting how much he had changed. She remarked that, while there was once merely darkness inside him, now he had become one with it entirely. Jinwoo, unwavering, acknowledged her perception, explaining that he had indeed united with the darkness she once glimpsed. Jinwoo then requested that Norma look into his future. She hesitated, but after a moment she reached out, grasping his hands. Closing her eyes, she focused deeply, and as the vision unfolded, her face grew sorrowful. Tears filled her eyes as she opened them again, burdened by the weight of what she had seen. She felt overwhelmed by the knowledge of the struggle awaiting Jinwoo, seeing the immense burden he would carry alone. The pain and sacrifice she saw in his future moved her, and she questioned how one person could bear such a fate, hinting that no one would remember him and that his war would be fought in solitude. Despite her distress, Jinwoo's expression softened at her words, as if they reassured him. He gently released her hands, thanking her for the favor and expressing his apology for the sudden visit. Before she could speak further, Jinwoo disappeared, sinking silently into the shadow beneath his feet, leaving Norma alone with the weight of the future she had glimpsed, a future only he would bear, fighting for a world that might never know the depths of his sacrifice. Standing on the rooftop of the tallest building, Jinwoo felt the weight of the moment pressing upon him. The city sprawled below, vast and unaware of the impending threat. He took out his phone, scrolling through his contacts until he found the one he was looking for. He dialed the number, and after a moment, Cha Hae-in's familiar voice came through. Hearing her voice reminded him of a sense of calm, a connection to something normal amidst the chaos. Jinwoo apologized for not being in touch, explaining how busy things had been, and Hae-in shared that her own life had been hectic as well. They acknowledged the long time that had passed since they last saw each other and spoke briefly about meeting again, a reunion that felt both close and painfully distant. She asked Jinwoo for a promise, a simple assurance that he would come to see her again. Jinwoo, with a gentle resolve, promised her he would return, offering his words as a way to ease her worry. Yet, despite his reassuring tone, Cha Hae-in couldn't shake a faint unease lingering in her heart, a feeling that quietly unsettled her beneath her calm exterior. Her thoughts were interrupted by Jong-in, who reminded her it was time to go. Caught between the lingering feelings from her call with Jinwoo and the urgency of the current moment, Hae-in refocused. Meanwhile, as she prepared to depart, alliances of hunters from all over the world were gathering. The Asian Hunter Alliance, the European Hunter Alliance, the African Temporary Guild Union, and the Chinese Emergency Response Alliance had mobilized, sending hundreds of thousands of hunters. All were ready to confront the overwhelming threat ahead, each alliance a testament to humanity's final stand against the impossible. Standing amidst the quiet of downtown, Jinwoo closed his eyes and focused intensely, sharpening his senses to seek out the unmistakable energy of the Dragon King among the massive army invading the land. It didn't take long for him to find it, a dark, powerful presence like the eye of a relentless storm consuming everything in its path. From that vast distance, his eyes locked onto the Dragon Kings. In that silent, invisible clash, each monarch recognized the other, an acknowledgement of the inevitable battle that lay ahead. The Dragon King, proud of the destruction he had caused and relishing in the lives he had taken, it dared Jinwoo to confront him, to stop hiding in the shadows and face him directly. Jinwoo's rage flashed through his eyes and his voice echoed, "I am coming for you." High atop a shattered building, the Dragon King stood, surveying the desolate scene below. For a moment, he considered the silence from his opponent. He wondered what Jinwoo might be planning, pondering if the Shadow Monarch had retreated, overwhelmed by the sheer size of the Dragon King's army. A force of 10 million. In an instant, a missile struck, exploding directly against his face, but he didn't move. More missiles followed, raining down in relentless waves. The Dragon King glanced up, watching the barrage with mild interest as fire and debris erupted around him. High above, soldiers soldiers and fighter jets communicated, their voices tense but hopeful that their attack had finally done some damage. Then the Dragon King revealed his true form, his enormous, terrifying shape taking over the sky. The pilots who had risked their lives hoping to delay his advance even for a second froze in horror as they saw the monstrous being they faced. Their confidence shattered, replaced by overwhelming dread, but their shock was short-lived. The Dragon King, his irritation turning to cold fury, unleashed a breath of pure destruction. Flames of annihilation shot from his mouth, engulfing the fighter planes and consuming them entirely. As the remnants of the aircraft fell in pieces, the Dragon King released a powerful roar that echoed through the heavens. It was a chilling proclamation, a challenge to the Shadow Monarch, letting all know that he was ready for war. Jinwoo opened his eyes, stirred by the powerful roar of the Dragon King echoing in the distance. It was a signal, a call to battle. Jinwoo knew it was time. He had spent the last moments in quiet reflection within the white castle Baru had created for him. The vast room, cold and still, held an emptiness that Jinwoo had found unexpectedly calming. He felt a bit of remorse for scolding Baru earlier about the castle's size, now appreciating the solitude it offered him as he prepared for the upcoming confrontation. With a soft voice, Jinwoo expressed his gratitude, acknowledging Baru's efforts. Baru, who had been silently waiting in the shadows, emerged upon hearing Jinwoo's call. Jinwoo cut him off before he could speak further, sensing his concern. Bellion rose alongside Baru, voicing his caution about the dangers ahead. Igris also stepped forward, sharing Bellion's concerns about Jinwoo's safety. Jinwoo looked at his three marshals, each devoted to him and determined to protect him at all costs. He knew that they, as shadow soldiers, prioritized his survival above all else, as their very existence depended on him. But he also knew that some battles demanded bravery beyond calculation, risks that had to be faced head-on. In his mind, Jinwoo thought of Ashborn, the former Shadow Monarch, who had once admired Jinwoo's unyielding nature, the part of him that always chose to confront danger, no matter how reckless the path. Jinwoo wondered what Ashborn would have done in this situation. This was a man who, even when the other fragments of luminosity rebelled against the Supreme Being, stood alone in his purpose, unwavering and true to his duty. Bellion, reflecting on Ashborn's legacy, felt the weight of the past and saw a familiar determination in Jinwoo. To him, Jinwoo's courage mirrored that of Ashborn, making the resemblance undeniable. With a renewed sense of loyalty, Bellion lowered his head, pledging himself fully to Jinwoo's cause. Bellion declared, "I will stand by you until the end, my lord." And his pledge was echoed in the silent agreement of Baru and Igris, who shared his unspoken commitment. Jinwoo stood ready, bolstered by the unwavering loyalty of his marshals, fully prepared for the intense battle looming before him. With a quiet resolve, he reached into his pocket and took out his cell phone, realizing that time was slipping away, and this moment might be his last chance to reach out to his family. Bellion, sensing Jinwoo's thoughts, gently suggested that he contact them. Yet, Jinwoo hesitated, his finger hovering over the call button. He knew that hearing his loved ones' voices could weaken his resolve, sparking emotions that might hold him back at this crucial moment. Without another thought, Jinwoo tightened his grip, and a sharp crack echoed as his phone shattered, the broken pieces slipping through his fingers and scattering on the ground. He would be content to hear their voices after the battle was over, if fate allowed it. With both his body and mind fully prepared, Jinwoo gave the signal, "Let's go." The renowned strength of the US Air Force seemed powerless against the overwhelming force of the Army of Destruction. The magic beast pursued the fighter jets relentlessly, and soon, one monstrous beast opened its massive jaws, snapping a jet in half as if it were nothing. A pilot, desperately attempting to escape, managed to eject himself just as his jet was crushed. As he fell through the sky, he looked on in horror, watching his fellow pilots being mercilessly wiped out in an instant. The sharp scent of gunpowder and blood filled his senses, and the sound of magic beasts growling and charging toward him intensified his fear. He cut the straps of his parachute hastily and grabbed the rifle nearby, clinging to whatever hope he could muster. Firing shot after shot, he aimed at the advancing beasts, his heart pounding as each bullet left the chamber. The shots echoed in his ears, but the beast didn't slow down. Soon he was out of bullets, left with an empty weapon and a grim realization he had not saved a bullet for himself. Just as his legs weakened and despair overtook him, one of the cockroach-like beasts closed in, towering over him menacingly. Helpless, he let out a final curse under his breath, but suddenly, a powerful unseen force ripped through the air, tearing the beast apart as if an enormous. Pilot stood paralyzed, his breath caught in awe and disbelief at the sight before him. He scanned the area frantically, seeking the source of the sudden rescue. His eyes finally locked onto an Asian man standing in front of him, holding daggers that were unmistakable even from a distance. This was Hunter Sung Jinwoo. His back faced the pilot, yet his very presence commanded both fear and relief. Jinwoo glanced over his shoulder briefly. His piercing gaze made it clear to the pilot that he should run. The danger wasn't over, and with good reason, as a new wave of magic beasts began charging toward them, drawn by the battle like bloodthirsty shadows. Bewildered and desperate, the pilot managed to call out Jinwoo's name, his voice raw with fear. Yet Jinwoo remained calm, unfazed by the monstrous force rapidly approaching. As the beast closed in, he activated his skill, Ruler's Authority. In that instant, the advancing magic beast halted abruptly, frozen in place. Then with a swift, unseen force, the creatures were crushed and torn apart, their forms obliterated, leaving trails of dark fluid splattering across the battlefield. With a fierce resolve, Jinwoo declared to himself that this was just the beginning. This battle would start here. As the fallen soldiers of the world of chaos lay scattered, Jinwoo steadied himself, inhaled deeply, and commanded in a powerful, steady voice, "Arise!" In response, blackened hands surged from the ground, reaching out to claim the remains. From the depths of the darkness, hundreds of magic beasts stirred, their forms consumed by the abyss, poised to follow their master into the coming storm. As soon as Jinwoo appeared on the battlefield, the Dragon King's attention instantly locked onto his position. The Dragon King recognized the Shadow Monarch's arrival on the eastern front. His sharp instincts were immediately alert, watching every move of the new threat. Yogumon, the Monarch of Transformation, considered the situation, contemplating whether they should gather all their forces and launch a coordinated attack against Jinwoo. His impatience was evident, eager to crush this lone challenger. Meanwhile, Tarnak, the Monarch of Iron Body, observed with a more strategic eye. He noticed something unusual, the absence of Jinwoo's army of the dead within his shadow forces. The Monarch of Iron Body concluded that Jinwoo must have dispersed his forces across a wider area, possibly in preparation for something else. The Dragon King pondered Jinwoo's tactics in silence. He sensed that Jinwoo might be aiming to draw their forces into a trap by appearing alone. The Shadow Monarch was trying to avoid direct confrontation, possibly to buy more time. This was a delicate game, and the Dragon King was wary of what Jinwoo could be planning. The unanswered question hung in the air. Just what was the Shadow Monarch's true goal? Elsewhere, far from the battlefield, news anchors were desperately trying to maintain their composure as they reported the escalating crisis. They explained how, after contact was lost with the hunters dispatched to subjugate the demonic beasts, the US government had quickly sent in the military. Their goal was clear, to hold off the oncoming wave of destruction long enough to evacuate civilians to safety. But even with the most powerful military on Earth, the monsters seemed unstoppable. Jimchul watched the news closely, taking in every detail. His mind raced as he processed the magnitude of the disaster. After Canada's fall, now even the United States, with all its strength, was being overrun by the monsters. The devastation was spreading, and humanity appeared utterly powerless in the face of it. As Jimchul thought about the terrifying situation unfolding on the other side of the world, he could only wonder what hope, if any, was left. He prayed for a miracle, something, anything, that could stop the devastation, but deep down he questioned if such a miracle even existed. At some point, the number of enemies became overwhelming, but Jinwoo continued to fight on instinct, as if his body had gone into autopilot. He cut through the horde of magic beasts with effortless precision, each swing and movement bringing down dozens of creatures. The sheer size of his shadow army grew rapidly, but even that seemed small compared to the endless number of beasts he faced. Jinwoo was like a machine, his body performing superhuman maneuvers with relentless speed. Hundreds of creatures were torn apart within moments, and each of them became new shadow soldiers. The battlefield was soon coated in black, a vast sea of shadows that stretched as far as the eye could see. It was as if the entire world was being swallowed by darkness, with each of Jinwoo's movements causing the black tide to swell even further. As this relentless cycle continued, Jinwoo sensed something different approaching. A new type of threat was on the horizon. Above him, hundreds of wyverns led by a dragon folk. They moved as one, blocking out the sunlight and casting a massive shadow over the battlefield. This force was unlike the others, and Jinwoo understood that they were part of the army of destruction. He realized that this was a new wave of enemies, though the Dragon King himself was still absent. Despite this, Jinwoo wasn't disappointed. He knew there was still plenty of time left for the battle to unfold. If the Dragon King was hesitating, Jinwoo understood that he would need to create a reason to force his hand. He would make sure the Dragon King had no choice but to face him directly. At the signal from the Dragon Folk, the Wyverns launched themselves straight toward Jinwoo, a coordinated and aggressive assault. In response, Jinwoo commanded with a single word, "Arise." Instantly, the dead bodies of the magic beasts that littered the battlefield transformed into shadows. These newly formed shadow soldiers hurled themselves at the incoming horde of Wyverns, colliding with them mid-air. Among the pack of Wyverns, a large dragon had been hiding, biding its time. A bright glow started to form in its mouth, a clear sign of an imminent attack. Without warning, the dragon unleashed a devastating plume of fire. The flames roared across the battlefield, incinerating the shadow soldiers instantly, reducing them to nothing in the intense heat. After delivering its fiery attack, the dragon gained altitude, climbing higher into the sky. The dragon folk watched with confidence, declaring the futility of opposing the great Dragon King with mere shadows made of mana. They were convinced of their superiority, believing that no such creations could stand against their might. But the dragon soon sensed something above it. Jinwoo, riding on the back of Kaisel, had already positioned himself high above the dragon's reach. He had moved so fast that the dragon had no time to react. By the time a chill ran down its spine in recognition of the danger, it was far too late. Jinwoo descended like a flash of light, moving with incredible speed. In an instant, Jinwoo landed on the dragon's head. With a single powerful strike, he drove the blade through the dragon's skull. The dagger's aura cut clean through. The fatal blow was swift, and the dragon's massive body went limp as its life force was instantly snuffed out. Meanwhile, the Dragon King sensed a shift. Some of his soldiers had been taken and absorbed into Jinwoo's growing shadow army. The Dragon King felt the provocation clearly and decided it was time to act. He declared that it was time to launch a full-scale attack. However, he needed to be cautious of Jinwoo's shadow army. The Dragon King ordered Yogamont, the monarch of transformation, to stay behind and prepare for an ambush in case the shadow army attempted to overwhelm them. Yogamont understood the command and stood ready. Now fully committed, the Dragon King himself prepared to join the battlefield. Before him, hundreds of gates began to open, all connecting directly to the eastern front. The portal swirled into existence, a sign that the army of destruction was finally on the move. On the western front, the battle was nearing its end. The situation was grim as the last line of defense, the US Army, was being overwhelmed by the relentless assault of the magic beasts from the world of chaos. Desperation filled the air as the soldiers fired their weapons without restraint. They shouted commands to keep firing, focusing on shooting the beasts in their legs or arms in hopes of slowing them down. Their only hope was to hold out long enough for backup from the hunters. Leading the attack were agile and deadly bug-type magic beasts. They moved swiftly, ignoring the hail of bullets that tried to stop them. The bugs advanced quickly, their sharp limbs cutting through the distance with ease. The soldiers' gunfire, rapid and frantic, couldn't slow them down. But just as one of the magic beasts prepared to strike, a powerful force suddenly slammed into it. Bam! With a single devastating punch, the beast was sent flying across the street. The impact was tremendous, scattering debris as the creature's body crashed into the ground. Thomas Andre had arrived on the battlefield, his presence alone shifting the momentum. A smirk formed on his face as he surveyed the scene. He had seen all these creatures before in dungeons. Thomas Andre stood unfazed as he scanned the battlefield. The monsters in front of him were nothing he hadn't seen or defeated before. Despite their numbers, they didn't pose any real threat. The soldiers around him, now filled with relief, recognized the presence of the scavenger guild, and hope flickered back into their eyes. However, there was one problem: a single, incredibly powerful magic beast among the rest. This creature stood apart from the others, watching the battle for a moment before slowly stepping forward. Its aura was menacing, unlike the lesser monsters around it. This was Tarnak, the monarch of Iron Body, a terrifying force who commanded monstrous humanoids. Tarnak recognized Thomas Andre from a previous encounter, when Thomas had nearly died at the hands of the Beast Monarch. Tarnak moved closer, its presence overwhelming. Despite its intimidating approach, Thomas appeared relaxed, almost indifferent to the threat in front of him. He dismissed the complexity of the situation, stating that he wasn't fond of confusing things. In the next moment, something unexpected unfolded. A thick, inky darkness began spreading from beneath Thomas Andre's feet, quickly covering the ground. The air grew tense, and it was then that a familiar voice spoke from behind Thomas. Grand Marshal Bellion, a towering figure in Jinwoo's army, addressed the situation with sharp, polite words, his tone laced with a subtle threat. From the shadow of Thomas emerged the massive force of Jinwoo's shadow army. They had been hiding within Thomas's shadow, patiently waiting for the right moment to strike. The appearance of this overwhelming force startled the monarch. Tarnak realized too late that he had been outmaneuvered. The shadow army had been concealing their presence, hidden in the human's shadow all along. Panic set in as Tarnak attempted to contact the Dragon King, but something was blocking him. His attempts at telepathy were met with silence, leaving him isolated from his allies. Quickly scanning the battlefield, Tarnak spotted the source of the interference. A high orc shaman, Tusk, standing firm and clutching a talisman. Tusk, now a general among Jinwoo's forces, was using the power of the Sphere of Avarice to block Tarnak's communication. Tarnak's mind raced as he processed what was happening. This clever strategy didn't align with the typical tactics of the Shadow Army, who usually faced their enemies head-on and sentenced them to death. This plan felt more human in its design, strategic, methodical, and deceptive. Anger boiled within Tarnak, and his body responded. His muscles swelled, growing larger until they seemed ready to burst. Tarnak roared in defiance, his pride wounded by the situation. In a rage, he declared that Jinwoo was unfit to be a monarch. At that moment, Baru stepped forward. The towering Ant King glared at Tarnak with sharp, insect-like eyes and hissed in fury. Baru would not tolerate such an insult toward his liege. His entire being radiated hostility as he demanded Tarnak to take back his words. Tarnak, consumed by rage, transformed into a monstrous humanoid beast, his body growing even larger. Furious that a mere soldier like Baru would dare to challenge him, but Baru was not intimidated. With a powerful screech, Baru's body doubled in size, his intent clear. The battle between these two powerful beings was about to erupt. The Dragon King watched as the soldiers of the world of chaos were being torn apart, his eyes fixed on Jinwoo, who stood at the very center of the destruction. Both of them faced each other from a distance, sensing that their battle was about to begin. The chaos surrounding them didn't matter, their focus was solely on one another. The Dragon King attempted to reach out to Tarnak, the monarch of Iron Body, but there was no response. Suspicion crept into his mind. Had Tarnak betrayed him, or was this another trick from Jinwoo? The Dragon King couldn't be sure, but the frustration grew as he couldn't contact his ally. Without hesitation, the Dragon King unleashed his powerful breath of destruction. In an instant, a blinding flash of light filled the battlefield as flames erupted from the Dragon King's mouth, spreading destruction in every direction. Jinwoo, sensing the incoming attack just in time, leaped out of the way. His quick reflexes allowed him to dodge the fiery breath, but the soldiers of both armies left behind were not as fortunate. They were caught in the firestorm, disintegrating into nothing as the flames consumed everything in their path. The sea of fire raged beneath the dark sky, burning everything under its gaze. The Dragon King scanned the battlefield, searching for Jinwoo amidst the flames, but he couldn't find him. For a moment, the Dragon King believed his attack had succeeded. However, Jinwoo had already mounted Kaisel, flying above the destruction from a safe distance. The Dragon King flinched, suddenly sensing Jinwoo's presence again. As soon as he located him, Jinwoo raised his hand and gave the command, "Arise." At Jinwoo's command, thousands of fallen soldiers rose, swelling the ranks of his shadow army. The battlefield teemed with his forces surging toward the Dragon King. Yet unfazed, the Dragon King remained unimpressed by the overwhelming numbers. His confidence did not falter, knowing the scale of his own forces. In the distance, Liu Zhigang was locked in battle with the giant magic beasts. With a swift slash of his sword, he cut a giant in half, landing gracefully on a broken building. Liu wasn't concerned. He had fought giants before and knew that they posed no significant challenge unless they were fought at sea, where their strength was amplified. As Liu scanned the battlefield, he felt the immense magical power coursing through the air. The land itself seemed to tremble with the energy of tens of thousands of hunters fighting endless waves of magic beasts across different fronts. His senses tingled from the overwhelming pressure of the magic power. Even at this distance, he could tell that the battle had finally begun on the other side as well, where the real confrontation was taking place. Meanwhile, the Dragon King generated an enormous amount of energy in his claws, preparing to unleash a devastating attack. In an instant, he struck the horde of shadow soldiers, slicing them into countless pieces. The shadow soldiers, hit by the intense flames, vanished into dust without the ability to regenerate. The Dragon King mocked their weakness. He taunted Jinwoo's efforts, efforts, believing that the Shadow Monarch had sent his main forces elsewhere, likely to confront the Monarch of Iron Body, while leaving behind only these weaker troops to face him. Expanding his perception, the Dragon King scanned for Jinwoo's presence, quickly locating him as he retreated. A chuckle escaped the Dragon King as he interpreted Jinwoo's movement as an attempt to flee. He wasn't about to let that happen. With a surge of energy, the Dragon King launched himself into the air, rocketing toward Jinwoo at incredible speed, intent on closing the distance. He swiftly leaped through a gate that transported him to the Western Front, where he expected to confront his enemy. On the other side, he was met with a formidable sight, 130,000 shadow soldiers standing ready. But that wasn't all. The fallen army of Chaos, which had been annihilated by Jinwoo's true shadow forces earlier, now rose to bolster the shadow ranks, having been absorbed into Jinwoo's command. The Dragon King was momentarily taken aback. Had Jinwoo already absorbed the troops of the Monarch of Iron Body? In the distance, the dying screams of Tarnak, the Iron Body Monarch, echoed as he was being torn apart by Baru and the relentless shadow soldiers. Realizing what had transpired, the Dragon King quickly assessed the situation. Jinwoo had demolished the Iron Body Monarch's forces before setting his sights on the Dragon King himself. It was a calculated strategy, one that was proving effective. However, the Dragon King remained confident. He believed Jinwoo was being reckless, even absurd in his approach. At that moment, the most powerful mage among the monarchs appeared at the Dragon King's side. The Monarch of Transfiguration, Yogamont, had been waiting for this critical moment. Without hesitation, Yogamont began opening numerous gates, spanning the battlefield and connecting distant points. The Dragon King addressed Jinwoo once more. Jinwoo might have assumed that only the Dragon King would be chasing him, but he was wrong. With Yogamont's gates, the Dragon King could summon an endless number of troops to his aid. His forces were now limitless, and Jinwoo's plan had been shattered. The Dragon King stood confident, certain he held the advantage in this battle. In his mind, Jinwoo had made a critical error, one that would lead to his own downfall. Yet Jinwoo's expression betrayed a hint of something unexpected, a faint smile. Then, without hesitation, he whispered the command to cancel his summons. At that instant, his shadow soldier sank back into his own shadow, disappearing from the battlefield. The Dragon King watched, bewildered, wondering why Jinwoo had withdrawn his army. The assumption was simple. Jinwoo had realized the hopeless gap between their powers and had given up. From the Dragon King's perspective, it was not surprising for Jinwoo to finally accept defeat. As if to capitalize on the moment, hundreds of thousands of soldiers surged from the gates, charging directly toward the Shadow Monarch. Jinwoo, however, stood undisturbed, closing his eyes as if in quiet preparation. Slowly, an intense energy began to gather around him, a spark forming that pulsed with something ancient and powerful. The Dragon King's gaze sharpened, a feeling of unease creeping over him as he noticed the subtle change in Jinwoo's aura. When Jinwoo opened his eyes again, his pupils had transformed into the fearsome, slitted eyes of a dragon. In that brief moment, the Dragon King felt the weight of a monumental realization. Something was horribly wrong. Jinwoo had tapped into an extraordinary power, the devastating force held within Kamish's runestone, a weapon so formidable that it struck fear into the hearts of the entire dragon race. As he unleashed this strength, a mighty roar erupted from the depths of his soul. This was dragon fear, a force so intense that it filled any weaker being with an overwhelming despair. The effect was immediate. The skill that Kamish once used to plunge the strongest hunters into terror now fell upon the dragons themselves, and even affected Yogamont. Screams and cries of anguish filled the air as countless beings found themselves paralyzed by the sheer force of Jinwoo's roar. His mana, endless and unyielding, amplified the power of dragon fear, leaving only the Dragon King able to withstand its full effect. The Dragon King looked around in disbelief, struggling to comprehend the sight before him. His dragon stood frozen in fear, and even Yogamont was rendered immobile. He could hardly accept that Jinwoo's power had reached such a height. Amid the chaos, Jinwoo seized the moment. Moving swiftly, he grabbed the Dragon King's arm with an iron grip and dragged him away from his allies. As the dark shadow enveloped both Jinwoo and the Dragon King, they vanished into a brief darkness before reappearing on the designated battlefield far from the Dragon King's army. Jinwoo immediately created distance, positioning himself strategically. The vast space was barren and isolated, a perfect stage for the duel that was about to unfold. Separated from his soldiers, the Dragon King took a moment to observe the strange and isolated landscape around him. He wondered aloud where they had arrived. Jinwoo calmly informed him that they were in a place far removed from the battlefield and the Dragon King's army, a place on the opposite side of the world where no one else could interfere. The Dragon King quickly grasped the underlying strategy in Jinwoo's move. He recognized that an all-out war might have been to Jinwoo's advantage if he'd brought the full force of his army, but sustaining that level of power would deplete his resources resources quickly. The Dragon King acknowledged the cleverness of this approach. His attention then shifted to the massive white castle perched on a hill, its imposing walls capped with a black flag flapping in the breeze. He narrowed his gaze, studying the structure thoughtfully. With a hint of disdain, he questioned if the castle belonged to Jinwoo. Jinwoo confirmed it was indeed his. However, the Dragon King remained unimpressed by its simplicity compared to the expectations he held for the Shadow Monarch's domain. Jinwoo stood unwavering, Kamish's wrath swirling fiercely around his hand, declaring that this castle would be the Dragon King's grave, a monument to his final defeat. The Dragon King, grasping Jinwoo's resolve, steeled himself for the clash. For him, this battle was a test of endurance until his forces arrived, yet he remained unfazed by the Shadow Army encircling him. With a powerful surge, he shifted into his true form, an enormous, awe-inspiring dragon that radiated pure destruction. His massive wings spread wide, casting ominous shadows across the battlefield as the Shadow Army closed in around him, ready for a decisive confrontation with the embodiment of destruction. As snow drizzled over a burning city in the United States, Norma Selner stood by a window, watching flames spread across the landscape. The conflict had engulfed their land in devastation, marking an unprecedented scene of destruction. David Brennan observed the intense flow of mana coursing wildly through the region. He couldn't shake his disbelief at the reality Sung Jinwoo had warned them about. This wasn't some distant myth, it was unfolding right before them. Desperately, he wondered aloud what their next move could be. Closing her eyes, Norma reached out with her vision, sensing the presence of hunters across the world. They had rallied from every corner of the globe, determined to join the fight. E-rank hunters, whose abilities barely rose above an average human's, fought alongside C ranks and D ranks, knowing full well their limited impact. Even with magical weapons, the battle remained a grim one. While a C rank might take down 10 beasts, and an S rank perhaps 1,000, each was destined to fall in this relentless war, their efforts blending into the dark sky like stars fading away. Yet as Norma turned back to David, a calm resolve was in her gaze. She explained that when all these stars fall together, they form a pattern, however faint. Through this dim constellation, one could see something more, a glimpse of what lay ahead. Gazing out once more, Norma saw what many would call despair, but to her, it appeared as something else, the faint glimmer of hope, resilient even amidst destruction. At the Hunter Association, Jim Chul felt a deep unease about the escalating situation. The recent news confirmed that Sung Jinwoo had successfully lured the enemy to an uninhabited island near Japan. This strategic location, remote and devoid of civilians, would allow the hunters to contain the destructive forces of the battle with minimal harm to populated areas. Jim Chul's mind drifted back to a past conversation with Jinwoo. Jinwoo had mentioned a large uninhabited island saturated with mana, left behind after a massive gate collapsed, releasing energy that lingered throughout the area. This battlefield choice suddenly made sense. Jinwoo had planned carefully, hiding himself in this place, anticipating this confrontation. The question arose of whether hunters should be sent to assist, but with nearly all S-rank hunters stationed in the United States, the options were scarce. Jim Chul pondered the possibilities, recalling how Jinwoo himself had once been an E-rank hunter. His journey from a low-ranking hunter to a powerful figure in this war was remarkable, a reminder that strength could emerge from any rank. Meanwhile, Jinwoo, riding on Kaizel, surged toward the Dragon King, who was preparing to unleash a fiery breath. But just as flames began to build within the Dragon King's throat, a sudden massive blade-like form struck. Bellion's centipede-like weapon lashed out, wrapping tightly around the Dragon King's mouth, sealing it shut. The intense fire remained trapped within, burning uselessly in the Dragon King's throat. Startled, the Dragon King shifted his gaze downward, meeting Bellion's fierce grip, holding his jaw shut with unwavering strength. Jima surged forward with unstoppable force, launching himself directly at the Dragon King and slamming him into the ground with immense power. His Naga soldiers followed closely, grasping the Dragon King firmly to hold him in place, their combined strength making the mighty Dragon King nearly immovable. Tusk soon joined, amplifying the attack with his gravitational abilities. He unleashed waves of force, thrashing and smashing the Dragon King, flipping him upside down and disorienting him. Then Baru and Greed leapt into the air, aiming precisely, and launched themselves like missiles, colliding brutally with the Dragon King's face. The impact sent shockwaves across the battlefield. Finally, Igris descended from above, wielding the Demon Monarch's sword with deadly precision. He landed a thunderous strike directly atop the Dragon King's head, lightning flashing around around him in explosive arcs that illuminated the chaotic scene. Jinwoo observed the intense mayhem from afar, watching closely from atop Kaisel's back as his powerful army relentlessly overwhelmed the Dragon King. His strategy seemed effective, yet suddenly, a deep menacing voice cut through the chaos. The Dragon King's eyes flared with a fiery intensity. His gaze locked onto Jinwoo with a new level of focus. The Dragon King found dark amusement in facing such overwhelming odds against him, remarking on the thrill of this reversal. Jinwoo felt an instinctual warning surge through his senses, signaling a powerful attack about to unfold. Just then, with an earth-shaking roar, the Dragon King unleashed the infamous Dragon Fear. The terrifying sound blasted outward, sending shockwaves that reverberated through Jinwoo's shadow army, shaking the ground beneath them and distorting the very air. The impact was immense, instantly breaking Jinwoo's connection to his soldiers as they faltered under the overwhelming aura. Recognizing the disruption, Jinwoo immediately withdrew his summon, momentarily dispelling his forces to protect them from the crushing power. In the next heartbeat, Jinwoo saw the Dragon King open his jaws, flames building within, preparing a devastating attack. Sensing the deadly fire about to erupt, Jinwoo quickly urged Kaisel into motion, darting out of range just in time. The Dragon King's fiery breath erupted, flooding the battlefield in an intense inferno, blazing like molten lava from an active volcano. The flames surged and roared, illuminating the dark surroundings with a fearsome fiery glow. The Dragon King smirked, revealing his true power. He was the embodiment of chaos, a being forged for war, ruthless and unstoppable. He reveled in the fury of battle, a force born to bring annihilation. With pride, he declared his identity, Antares, the King of Dragons and the Monarch of Destruction. Jinwoo, feeling the immense pressure of the situation, felt his legs weaken beneath him. The sheer force of the Dragon King's presence was staggering. Jinwoo's thoughts raced, the memory of the King of Giants' death flashing through his mind. The tremendous mana released during that battle had sunk into the ground, but even that power had been nothing compared to Antares' destructive force. If one of his soldiers were to take a direct hit from the Dragon King's breath, even the undying shadow soldiers would be obliterated instantly. Antares spoke, his voice carrying both a challenge and a strange kind of admiration. He noted Jinwoo's nervousness and calmly reassured him. When Jinwoo had grabbed his arm during the fight, he could have easily broken free, yet he chose not to, as Jinwoo had impressed him by forcing him into a difficult position. Jinwoo was wary but listened intently. Antares, recognizing Jinwoo's strength and potential, made his intentions clear. As a fellow monarch, he sought a quiet exchange, offering information that Jinwoo, if he had inherited the memories of the previous Shadow Monarch, would likely already know. Their true enemy wasn't the world they inhabited, but a far greater threat, one that existed beyond the skies. This enemy was the army of the rulers, beings whose sole purpose was to eradicate the monarchs, those born from darkness. Antares explained that even the Shadow Monarch was not exempt from this fate. Antares, once resolute in his plan to eliminate Jinwoo and prepare for the impending battle against their shared enemies, found himself reconsidering. Watching Jinwoo fight had changed his perspective. Jinwoo's abilities were unlike Ashborn's. He possessed a unique set of talents. Antares could see a glorious victory within those talents, a potential that set Jinwoo apart. Antares offered Jinwoo a choice. If Jinwoo wished for his family to be spared, Antares would grant it. If he wanted his country to remain unharmed, Antares would ensure its safety. Even if Jinwoo desired Antares and his army to leave, they would depart quietly. Antares wasn't just offering a minor concession, he was offering Jinwoo dominion over the entire planet. Antares believed Jinwoo had the qualifications to become its ruler. Antares extended his hand toward Jinwoo, presenting a tempting offer. All Jinwoo had to do was accept his hand, and together they could combine their powers to defeat the army of the rulers. In doing so, Jinwoo's family, his country, and the entire planet would be granted peace and freedom. It was a proposition that held immense weight, a future where the chaos would end under their united strengths. But Jinwoo's answer was immediate and sharp. The idea made him scoff as he saw through the facade. He didn't trust the Dragon King, not for a moment. His mind was sharp, and he could see the truth in Antares' eyes. A burning desire for destruction, for death. As Jinwoo's rejection echoed, the Dragon King's expression shifted. What had once been a mask of calm shattered. Antares let out a roar of laughter, his booming voice reverberating with mana, shaking the very ground beneath them. This was his last gesture of mercy, a final moment given and rejected. Diplomacy had failed, and now only raw force remained. If deception could not defeat Jinwoo, then he would simply crush him. With a thunderous stomp, the Dragon King stretched his massive claws forward, causing everything around him him to tremble violently. Jinwoo quickly dodged, narrowly avoiding the devastating force of the blow. In that split second, he summoned Kaisel. The wyvern burst from Jinwoo's shadow, letting out a powerful screech as it ascended. As the blinding light surged from the Dragon King's mouth, Jinwoo commanded Kaisel to dive. Kaisel swooped downward just in time, evading the blinding flames that scorched the air right above Jinwoo's head. The powerful flames erupted, lighting up the battlefield with fierce intensity. When the Dragon King's breath finally subsided, Kaisel seized the opportunity, speeding toward his forehead. Jinwoo's mana surged, his focus intense as he prepared Kamish's wrath in his hand. He swung the blade with full force, and the black aura split into multiple tendrils that lashed against the Dragon King's head with a brutal impact. The Dragon King faced the full might of Jinwoo's attack as the powerful aura of Kamish's wrath crashed against him. Jinwoo watched closely, his heart pounding, but the devastating attack left not a single mark on the Dragon King's armored scales. The Monarch of Destruction looked up, his fierce gaze showing nothing but confidence, completely unaffected. Realizing the danger, Jinwoo immediately directed Kaisel to retreat, but before they could escape, an ear-piercing screech cut through the air. It was the Dragon King's Dragon's Fear, a terrifying energy that pulsed with raw power. Although Jinwoo held firm this time, Kaisel froze mid-flight, struggling under the oppressive force. Just as Jinwoo prepared to call Kaisel back, the Dragon King's flames roared forth, a massive torrent of fire aimed directly at them. But as Jinwoo tumbled to safety, he looked back in horror, his heart breaking as he saw Kaisel's form turning to ash, disappearing into nothingness. The Dragon King unleashed a fierce blast of fire, the sheer force of it hurling Jinwoo off his path. The intense flames scorched everything they touched, reducing the surrounding terrain to molten ruin. As the Dragon King scanned the landscape, he sneered, certain Jinwoo wouldn't be defeated so easily. Jinwoo clung desperately to the jagged edge of a stone cliff, his grip firm but strained. His heels dug deep into the rocky surface as he used Kamish's dagger to anchor himself, steadying his body against the intense heat. A realization hit him. His surroundings felt like magma, the surface burning hot beneath him. Gritting his teeth, Jinwoo drove Kamish's wrath into the rock with tremendous force, bracing himself. Suddenly, a massive shadow loomed above him, and the Dragon King's colossal foot came crashing down. But Jinwoo reacted swiftly, dodging the devastating blow in time. With fierce resolve, Jinwoo curled his lips and commanded, "Arise." Instantly, 3 immense shadows rose from the ashes, each forming into the shape of ancient dragons. These shadow dragons, fierce and powerful, launched themselves toward the Dragon King, surrounding him from both sides. One dragon latched its mighty jaws around the Dragon King's neck, while the other 2 summoned blazing orbs of fire within their jaws. In perfect coordination, they unleashed fiery blasts upon the Dragon King, flames wrapping around him in a devastating assault. Jinwoo stood atop the rocky edge, watching intently as his shadow dragons poured their fury upon the formidable Monarch of Destruction. Jinwoo's mind raced as he observed the battle, his thoughts consumed by the overwhelming power of the Dragon King, Antares. He had never faced an opponent with such raw strength and defense, far beyond anything he had encountered before. Jinwoo knew his usual tactics wouldn't work here. He needed something more, something stronger. As the realization hit him, Jinwoo's mind sparked with a sudden idea. His eyes widened as a thought formed. Armor. If he could shape the power of darkness, why not mold it into something more? Something that could protect him and amplify his strength. While the Dragon King was focused on decimating the shadows of ancient dragons, Jinwoo began to act. Shadows spread from beneath him, wrapping around his body, thickening and taking shape. A dark essence started to flow from the shadows, swirling around him, growing stronger with each passing second. Antares, busy with the onslaught of shadow dragons, suddenly sensed the change. He noticed something unusual, a movement in Jinwoo's aura. The power of darkness was building, coiling around the Shadow Monarch's body in layers. Antares paused for a brief moment, realizing that something dangerous was happening. Jinwoo's figure began to expand, the black shadows molding into armor, growing larger and sturdier with every second. His silhouette transformed, becoming something far more imposing. The darkness wasn't just for offense anymore. It was forming a massive suit of armor, a towering figure that could rival the sheer size and strength of the Dragon King. The Dragon King stared in shock as he witnessed the rise of an immense shadowy figure that towered over the battlefield, its form nearly reaching the sky. Tens of thousands of black lightning bolts struck its massive shoulders, as if the world itself was trying to reject its existence. The Dragon King's thoughts raced. This wasn't something he expected. Astralization was a form reserved for beings far beyond beyond the Shadow Monarch's reach. He questioned how this could be happening. The Shadow Monarch was once one of the fragments of light, beings not meant to take on such forms. Yet here he was, standing before him as a colossal figure of pure darkness. It made no sense. A troubling theory began to form in the Dragon King's mind. Could it be that Jinwoo had summoned the very power of death onto Earth? This shouldn't have been possible for a human, especially one who had only recently gained these abilities. How was Jinwoo able to control such an unimaginable force, the power of death itself, on such a massive scale? Meanwhile, Jinwoo, now fully enveloped in this enormous shadowy body, glanced at his own hand. His fingers, though composed of darkness, moved at his command. It was surreal. He questioned whether this was truly him, as he felt a connection to this form unlike anything he had ever experienced. From within the towering shadow form, Jinwoo realized that this is the true strength of the Shadow Monarch Ashborn that had been passed down to him. It wasn't just raw power, it was an endless, overwhelming force that coursed through his new form, filling him with a strength far beyond what he had previously known. This was the ultimate gift, the legacy of Ashborn, now fully awakened within him. The Dragon King, momentarily impressed, acknowledged Jinwoo's strength. He realized that Jinwoo had lived a life balanced between the realms of the living and the dead, which allowed him to wield such immense power. The Dragon King understood now why the former Shadow Monarch, Ashborn, had entrusted such a force to a mere human. Jinwoo had been fighting battles long before he ever received this strength, battles for survival. But the Dragon King knew this made Jinwoo too dangerous to leave alive. He had to kill him. Without hesitation, the Dragon King unleashed a blazing inferno, sending it hurtling towards Jinwoo with terrifying speed. Jinwoo reacted swiftly, raising his hand as an unimaginable energy pulsed within it. He hurled it toward the approaching flames. The clash of forces was immense as the collision of the Dragon King's fire and Jinwoo's black lightning sent explosive shockwaves across the battlefield. The Dragon King charged at full force, but Jinwoo held his ground, matching the Dragon King's physical strength blow for blow. For a moment, they wrestled in a deadlock, but the Dragon King, with his sheer size and power, began to gain the upper hand. His massive claws reached out, ready to tear Jinwoo apart, but Jinwoo was quick, too quick. He blocked the Dragon King's attack with his left hand, and with his right, delivered a crushing punch to the Dragon King's face. Undeterred, Jinwoo went for another strike, but this time, the Dragon King dodged. He rushed back at Jinwoo, jaws wide, and clamped down hard on Jinwoo's side. The Dragon King lifted him effortlessly, shaking him like a rag doll until he seemed satisfied with the damage inflicted. Then, with a final brutal motion, he hurled Jinwoo into the air, sending him crashing to the ground with devastating force. The earth beneath him shattered on impact. A blazing streak from the Dragon King's breath of destruction followed, searing past Jinwoo and missing him by mere inches as he dodged at the last second. Jinwoo, the Shadow Monarch, skidded across the asphalt, regaining his balance immediately. Charging forward, his sword infused with mana, he advanced again. The Dragon King unleashed another fiery blast aimed directly at him, but this time Jinwoo didn't evade it. Instead, he raised his mana-infused sword, slashing through the wildfire at its source. He followed up with another swing of his sword, but the Dragon King, agile despite his size, escaped Jinwoo's onslaught and darted to the opposite side of the battlefield. In an instant, his enormous wings flapped, lifting him off the ground. High above, the Dragon King conjured a series of fiery portals in the sky, unleashing a torrent of flames down upon Jinwoo. It was as if the heavens themselves were raining fire, obliterating everything below. Yet amidst the chaos, the Dragon King sensed something, a shift in the energy around him. Before he could react, a sword, pulsating with mana, pierced through his massive form. A howl of agony escaped the Dragon King as more swords rose from the ground, each one aimed at him. Jinwoo unleashed a barrage of these mana-infused swords, each one streaking through the air, targeting the Dragon King to counter his fiery attacks. But the Dragon King was far from finished. Gathering his immense power, he unleashed another barrage of fire, this time meeting the oncoming swarm of swords mid-air. The two forces collided with a deafening explosion, lighting up the sky with a cataclysmic explosion of energy. In the end, the fire of the Dragon King proved stronger. It tore through the barrage of swords, breaking past Jinwoo's defenses. The flames descended upon Jinwoo, engulfing him in a devastating blow that scorched everything around him. As the dust settled, Jinwoo struggled to rise to his feet. Panting heavily, Jinwoo reverted to his human form, his body battered and scorched from the intense battle. His vision cleared just enough to make out the figure of the Dragon King approaching through the thick fog, emerging from the aftermath of the explosion. Jinwoo felt the weight of his exhaustion as he realized just how much stamina it took to wield such immense power. Every moment felt like a drain on his life force. From across the battlefield, the Dragon King shifted back into his human form, his imposing presence cutting through the haze. Jinwoo knew their confrontation was far from over. Steeling himself, he reached for his weapon, drawing forth Kamish's wrath. In response, the Dragon King unsheathed his own sword, a mocking grin spreading across his face as if to belittle Jinwoo's attempt to fight. Without hesitation, both combatants charged at each other, their movements a blur of speed and precision. The Dragon King's sword met Jinwoo's daggers with a violent clash, sending sparks flying in every direction. As they fought, the Dragon King's voice echoed in Jinwoo's mind. He reminded Jinwoo of the devastation unfolding across the battlefield, the destruction wrought by the Monarch of Transfiguration and the Army of Destruction. With each clash of their weapons, the Dragon King's words cut deeper than his blade. He taunted Jinwoo, warning that everything he sought to protect would be reduced to ashes, an illusion that would crumble under the weight of the inevitable. But as the battle raged on, one of the Kamish's wrath daggers, already weakened from striking the Dragon King's tough scales, finally gave way. It shattered, leaving Jinwoo with only one weapon in hand. The Dragon King seized the moment, his eyes burning with malice. With a swift and deadly motion, he drove his sword into Jinwoo's stomach. The blade pierced through, blood spilling from the wound as Jinwoo gasped in pain, his body jerking from the force of the blow. The Dragon King's voice rang out, cold and merciless. His words cut deep as he spoke of the destruction and suffering that blanketed the world. He pulled the sword back, leaving Jinwoo to stagger, blood dripping onto the ground beneath him. Jinwoo dropped to his knees, struggling to maintain his composure as pain racked his body. The Dragon King loomed over him, his sword resting heavily on Jinwoo's shoulders. He spoke of despair, of the cries of humanity being silenced under the weight of destruction. His words carried the weight of the countless lives lost in this war, taunting Jinwoo to regret his decisions, to feel the despair of those he could not save. But Jinwoo's resolve didn't falter. Glaring back at the Dragon King with fierce determination, he refused to surrender. The fire in his eyes burned just as brightly as ever, despite the pain and the blood. He wasn't finished yet. Just then, a sudden shift in the air caught the Dragon King off guard. The dagger that had been scattered earlier came hurtling back. It struck the Dragon King from behind, embedding itself deep into his back. The unexpected attack momentarily distracted the Dragon King, but he quickly regained his composure. His lips curled into a smirk as he looked at Jinwoo. He dismissed it with arrogance, knowing it would take more than a weapon forged from a dragon's tooth to harm the King of Dragons. The Dragon King chuckled darkly. He found it amusing, this clash between two beings of such contrasting origins, a flame born from darkness and darkness born from light. The battle had been fierce, but to him, it seemed that its end was drawing near. His confidence oozed with every word, as if the outcome had already been decided. But Jinwoo, the Shadow Monarch, remained undeterred. He could see the end too, but not in the way the Dragon King imagined. Jinwoo's silence spoke louder than words, and without hesitation, he launched himself forward, dashing toward the Dragon King with relentless speed. The Dragon King raised his sword high, ready to strike down this defiant monarch. He mocked Jinwoo, proclaiming that the Army of Destruction wouldn't even need to search for this place. He would raise their spirits by delivering Jinwoo's severed head as a trophy. But as Jinwoo closed the distance, something shifted. The Dragon King's instincts screamed at him. Something was wrong. He quickly realized that Jinwoo was not alone. Emerging from the darkness, Jinwoo's shadow soldiers materialized behind him. They surged forward with outstretched hands, their collective presence like a tide of darkness aimed at the Dragon King. The Dragon King's bellow echoed through the battlefield. His fury boiled over, and he roared his final threat, promising to tear Jinwoo apart and feed him to the drakes. Jinwoo's hand pulsed with raw energy as he charged forward, the power within him reaching its peak. It wasn't just his strength driving him in this moment, it was the memory of his father, the man who had drawn his dagger to protect his family. It was the Shadow Monarch Ashborn who had entrusted Jinwoo with all his power, but most of all, it was Jinwoo himself, who had taken upon the burden to protect this world and end the cycle of death and destruction that had plagued it for so long. In one swift, decisive motion, Jinwoo slashed the Dragon King with his dagger. The blade cut through the Dragon King's defenses, ripping a streak of light right through his massive form, splitting him in two. Jinwoo, his body trembling with rage, gritted his teeth as his words echoed, "I wonder if you can see your own death." Summoning his father's dagger from his inventory, Jinwoo felt the weight of the memory deep within him. His father's sacrifice, his fight to protect what mattered most. It was all fueling Jinwoo now. The sky above crackled with lightning, as if the very gods were witnessing this climactic battle. In that instant, Jinwoo's dagger found its mark. It penetrated the Dragon King's armor and pierced his heart with a final devastating blow. The Dragon King staggered, looking down at the wound in shock. He hadn't thought it was possible, yet there it was. A strike that even his formidable armor couldn't withstand. His eyes widened as he looked up, sensing something remarkable unfolding above him. In the skies, an overwhelming sight appeared. The ruler's army pouring out from massive gates in endless waves. The white armored soldiers filled the air, turning the once dark sky into a vast sea of shining figures. The Dragon King stared in awe, unable to comprehend the scene. He remembered when he first arrived, there had been no gate, no hint of an army prepared for such an invasion. It should have required an immense force to open a passage between worlds. He realized now that he had been outmaneuvered, but still he was unable to comprehend how Jinwoo had managed to communicate with the rulers. It should have been impossible. Jinwoo watched the Dragon King's realization unfold, his voice steady as he explained that there was indeed a way. The rulers had lent their power to human vessels who remained here. These vessels had served as a bridge, allowing the rulers to sense and prepare gates at this exact location, ready to launch their assault. The Dragon King realized the full extent of Jinwoo's plan. He acknowledged the cleverness of his move. Jinwoo had used the vessels to secure a gate, ensuring his victory in the war, regardless of the outcome of this battle. Jinwoo stared at the Dragon King. His words carried a sense of certainty as he declared that it was the Dragon King who had orchestrated the attack on the Shadow Monarch, the one who had commanded both the Monarch of White Flames and the Beast Monarch. The Dragon King paused, sensing the weight in Jinwoo's words, and asked if the Monarch of White Flames had confessed as much. Jinwoo uttered a single name, Ashborn. His smile widened slightly as he looked at the Dragon King. Then, with a defiant gesture, Jinwoo flipped his middle finger at the Dragon King and said, "Ashborn sends his regards." This small act of rebellion enraged the Dragon King beyond measure. In a fit of fury, the Dragon King leaped forward, his sword poised to strike down the seemingly defenseless Jinwoo. But before the blade could make contact, from every direction, spears of light shot forward, piercing the Dragon King. The sudden assault left him frozen in place, and as he looked up, his gaze landed on the figure descending from above. The six-winged angel, glowing with an ethereal brilliance, was the brightest fragment of luminosity, the one who had arrived at the final moment. The battle had reached its inevitable conclusion. As the Dragon King's strength waned, his gaze softened in resignation. He murmured, marveling at the balance of blinding light and overwhelming darkness that had surrounded him in this fight. He admitted in his final breath that victory had always been beyond his reach, accepting his fate in a tone filled with exhaustion yet strange satisfaction. He whispered of an eternal rest, a true rest he hoped would await him, promising to meet Jinwoo there someday. With a calm, steady voice, Jinwoo responded, assuring the Dragon King that their paths would indeed cross again, that this conclusion was only a pause in their long and turbulent histories. As the Dragon King breathed his last, the remnants of the fierce battle lingered in the air. The sky, which had been torn apart by their clash, slowly returned to peace. The brightest fragment of luminosity stood before Jinwoo, its radiant form showing a rare sense of gratitude. The ruler acknowledged that Jinwoo's actions had brought an end to their long, grueling war and admitted not knowing how to fully express gratitude for what he had done. Jinwoo, thoughtful yet resolute, responded with a request that caught the ruler off guard. He explained that there was something only the brightest fragment could grant him, a request that he hoped would fulfill a purpose close to his heart. Intrigued, the ruler promised to help in any way possible. With unwavering conviction, Jinwoo asked to use the Cup of Reincarnation once more, a divine tool capable of turning back time. The request stunned the rulers, who looked at Jinwoo in disbelief. The ruler clarified the consequences of this choice, reminding Jinwoo that turning back time would also revive the fallen monarchs, and their memories would remain intact, enabling them to retain knowledge of everything they had faced in this life. Yet Jinwoo stood firm. He accepted this risk, making it clear that he would confront the monarchs alone if necessary. Even in the void of the dimensional gap, he would ask the rulers not to interfere with Earth if time were to be reset. His plan was to shoulder the weight of battle by himself, sparing Earth from the chaos he had just fought so hard to protect it from. The ruler, sensing the gravity of this moment, questioned him, wondering aloud why he would willingly take on such a heavy burden. Many times, they had used the Cup of Reincarnation, but the outcome Jinwoo had achieved in this timeline was the best they had seen. Jinwoo's gaze fell to his father's dagger, the blade a reminder of all he had lost. He wanted to reverse the tragedy, to bring back those lost in the battle, and to save those who mattered most to him. The brightest fragment, however, cautioned him about the limits of the cup's power. Its durability was nearly exhausted, and if he failed this time, there would be no other chance. Now he could rest as a hero remembered by all who survived, the savior who ended the invasion. But in choosing to go back, he would face the monarchs alone in the gap between worlds, with no one left to remember his final battle if he succeeded, or to mourn him if he did not. Jinwoo paused, closing his eyes. He visualized the faces of those he held close. His mother and sister huddled together, worriedly watching the news. Cha Haein fighting with fierce determination against the monsters threatening their world. Jim Chul, eyes wet with emotion, unable to look away from the unfolding events on his screen. Jinho, tirelessly managing calls in the Ahjin Guild's office. Each one fueled his resolve, filling him with a warmth that washed away any doubt. As Jinwoo opened his eyes, his resolve was unshakable. He knew his path, and he firmly declared his decision to go back in time, embracing the weight of what lay ahead. The brightest fragment of luminosity observed him with a quiet respect, sensing the strength in his choice. Jinwoo's desire to save the entire world with his own hands, to shoulder the burdens alone, reminded the ruler of Ashborn, the Shadow Monarch before him. With understanding, the fragment offered his support, wishing Jinwoo luck in the monumental task he was about to undertake. Jinwoo paused for a moment, his thoughts turning to the shadow soldiers he had gathered along his journey. He asked what would happen to those soldiers who hadn't existed in the past. The fragment of luminosity explained any soldier who existed in the past would be lost, while those unique to this timeline would remain. Jinwoo realized what this meant. Some soldiers like Baru would stay by his side, while others like Greed would be gone. With a faint grin, Jinwoo nodded, accepting the consequences. He was ready. Sensing Jinwoo's commitment, the brightest fragment of luminosity summoned the cup of reincarnation from a different dimension. The mystical object shimmered with an otherworldly power, a final symbol of Jinwoo's courage. As he stood poised for his return to the past, the ruler offered a solemn wish. May Jinwoo's bravery be the key to saving his world. With the purest intention, the brightest fragment of luminosity turned the cup of reincarnation upside down, letting its radiant light flow out and spill across the world. This light, powerful and boundless, spread over the land, filling every corner of existence with a gleaming brilliance. The earth for a moment was bathed in a gentle, all-encompassing glow. Across the world, this light reached everyone. It moved swiftly, spreading silently and completely over the entire world. In that brief, intense moment, it became the only presence, enveloping everything and everyone as if preparing them for something new. And then, just as suddenly as it had come, the light faded away, leaving no trace. But its impact was undeniable. The world, wrapped in that brief yet brilliant glow, stood on the verge of transformation, ready to be rewritten as time itself shifted under Jinwoo's bold, selfless wish. In the heart of Korea, Seoul awoke to a bright, clear morning. Fresh air filled the city, and the sunlight gently touched every corner, including a cozy apartment where the start of a new day meant familiar routines for a family. Inside, Gina moved through the morning light as her mother asked her to check on her brother. With a cheerful response, Gina rushed to Jinwoo's room and opened the door, expecting to find him still asleep. Instead, she blinked in surprise. Her brother was already awake. Through his closed eyes, Jinwoo could sense the warmth of the sun's rays touching his face. He smiled, watching Gina stand in the doorway, full of life and untouched by the tragedies that had once been part of their reality. He saw in her a carefree spirit, untouched by battles and loss. Jinwoo's heart warmed as he quietly absorbed the scene, savoring every familiar sound and scent. Gina moved down the hall, and Jinwoo could hear the sounds of breakfast being prepared. The rich smell of stew filled the air, and the familiar sounds of morning life. Footsteps, cooking, the peaceful hum of home made his heart beat faster. He was back, truly back, in the home he had longed to see again. From the kitchen, his mother, Kyung-hee, noticed him awake. She looked over with a warm smile as she prepared breakfast, her movements light and free from the shadow of the eternal sleep disease that had once plagued her. Then Jinwoo heard the rustling of a newspaper and turned his gaze toward the dining table. Without realizing it, Jinwoo found himself whispering the word, "Father." His father raised an eyebrow at the formal address, sensing the intensity in Jinwoo's gaze and the tears his son was struggling to hold back. Jinwoo's words to his father served as a grounding moment, reassuring himself that everything he had just experienced was nothing but a nightmare. A nightmare that was now over. As he stood there, his heart filled with warmth, he took in the presence of his younger sister Gina, his healthy mother Kyung-hee, and his father, who had not disappeared. This was his family, safe and whole. Jinwoo silently vowed to himself that he would protect this precious reality. He recognized this as a final chance, one he would not waste. With this new beginning, he knew he had the power to rewrite the future. But for now, he allowed himself a moment to breathe and enjoy the peace. Jinwoo thought about how, just for a little while, he wanted to cherish the tranquility surrounding him. He acknowledged the looming threats of the monarchs, who were surely preparing their next assault. Yet if this brief period of calm didn't harm anyone, then he longed to extend it, if only for a single day longer. As Kyung-hee went about her morning routine, a flash of curiosity led her to Jinwoo's room. Her eyes caught sight of a letter resting on his desk, a note left behind by her son. The message was simple, yet heavy with purpose. Jinwoo had written that he would return after he had finished what he needed to do. Jinwoo had already entered the rift between dimensions. Standing amidst the dark expanse, he faced a vicious magic beast that glared at him, filled with malice. But before it could move, Baru struck with blinding speed, tearing the creature's head off in one smooth motion. Around them, piles of defeated beasts lay scattered, a testament to the fierce battles fought. Bellion stood nearby, his sword plunged into the ground, ever watchful and steady. In the vast emptiness of the dimensional crack, where darkness stretched endlessly without a hint of life, Jinwoo stood, feeling the heavy solitude pressing down on him. This realm was barren, a place of nothingness where only battles seemed to bring any sense of purpose. Reflecting on his journey, Jinwoo knew he had already defeated many powerful foes, including the Monarch of Transfiguration, Yogumunt, who had been at the center of the war's devastation. It had been an exhausting and relentless struggle, but after 27 long years within this isolated dimension, he sensed that the end of this war was finally approaching. Now the only remaining enemy was the formidable Dragon King, along with his soldiers, the Brigade of Destruction. Fortunately, Jinwoo understood that time passed differently in this isolated dimension compared to the outside world. While he had endured nearly 3 decades within this void, only about 2 years had elapsed in the world he had left behind. The thought of returning to his family filled him with a rare warmth. He wondered how his father and mother were faring and how much Gina would have changed. He imagined explaining everything to her one day, perhaps when she was ready to understand. As Jinwoo's thoughts settled, Bellion, his loyal marshal, approached. With his powerful presence, Bellion informed Jinwoo that every enemy in the immediate area had been eliminated. Jinwoo nodded in acknowledgement. With his gaze fixed on the direction where he could feel the overwhelming energy of the Dragon King, Jinwoo gathered his resolve for this final battle. Summoning his power, he prepared to raise new forces. His voice resonated through the shadows, commanding, "Arise!" In response, shadows rose from the countless fallen corpses, forming new soldiers to join his army. The Dragon King, Antares, stood unwavering as he sensed the approach of an army so vast it stretched beyond calculation. The immense power radiating from the advancing soldiers made even his most seasoned subordinates hesitate. One of them, deeply concerned, informed Antares of the defeat of the Monarch of Transfiguration, Yogumunt, and nervously suggested retreat. However, Antares refused. He had tired of endless evasion, and now he intended to face the Shadow Monarch here, with no intention of fleeing. The Dragon King marveled at Sung Jinwoo's will, recalling the impossible use of the Cup of Reincarnation to turn back time itself. Antares hadn't expected to stand against this Shadow Monarch a second time, alive and resolute, but he knew this battle would finally conclude, granting eternal rest to one of them. With a chilling chuckle, Antares introduced himself, his voice carrying the magnitude of his power and legacy. Draped in black armor that absorbed the surrounding darkness, declared his name with a steady gaze, Sung Jinwoo. He asked the Dragon King if there was anything more to say, and with a firm refusal, Antares stepped down from his throne, his massive ancient dragon stationed on either side. Jinwoo pointed forward, wordlessly commanding his army, which immediately surged toward Antares with near endless force, his soldiers moving like a shadowed tide of nearly 10 million strong. The Dragon King, Antares, unleashed a thunderous roar that rippled through the battlefield, commanding his own army of destruction to counter the assault. Both met head-on, and the two powers clashed with resounding impact. Jinwoo's dagger met the force of Antares' colossal sword, signaling the final showdown in this war. With time seeming to slow, Antares swung his blade in a powerful arc, and Jinwoo blocked it with one dagger while channeling his dark aura into the other. In the rift between dimensions, light and darkness clashed with a fierce brilliance, marking the decisive end of their long and grueling war. In the real world, 2 years had passed, and America was now in a state of shock and fear. A prophecy had spread, stirring a wave of anxiety across the nation. Normally, predictions like these would have been dismissed, but this one came from Norma Selner. Her words carried weight because her predictions had repeatedly come true, even foretelling world-shaking events like the fall of the North Korean leader, major global terror incidents, and the economic collapse in the real estate sector. Her prophecies had brought her into the center of both fame and controversy. Now, with a solid solemn warning, she had foretold a terrifying fate. A god of death would soon descend upon the earth, bringing endless soldiers of death. No one, she claimed, would escape. The impact of her words echoed worldwide, causing panic and grim anticipation. News outlets covered her prophecy extensively, sparking conversations and fears on every street and in every household. Then, as if the prophecy were manifesting, the skies over Seoul darkened. A massive black hole appeared, stretching across the horizon, nearly swallowing the sky. People from around the globe had gathered to witness this strange phenomenon, eyes locked on the gaping void that held the potential for destruction. The headline spoke of Selner's prophecy, filling every newspaper as citizens stared up at the darkened skies with a mix of dread and fascination. Suddenly, the black gate began to shift, drawing gasps from the crowd. A murmur spread as the gate appeared to open, stirring the onlookers into a state of rising panic. Yet as the gate parted, there was only emptiness, a vast, unyielding nothingness. People gazed up in confusion. Whispers of disbelief echoed as the dark portal, defying expectations, started to close. On a quiet street, Jinwoo ended his stealth, blending into the crowd without drawing attention. People remained focused on the mysterious, vanishing gate above, not noticing the young figure of a middle schooler who seemed to appear out of nowhere. As Jinwoo took in the sight of the crowd, he noticed a young man standing nearby, holding an elegant bouquet of flowers. The stranger, with a calm smile, welcomed Jinwoo back. It was clear he recognized Jinwoo, not just as an ordinary person, but as the Shadow Monarch himself. Jinwoo, though unfamiliar with the man, felt no sense of danger from him, only a steady and respectful presence. The man observed Jinwoo with an admiring curiosity, noting the unusual choice of Jinwoo's youthful appearance. Jinwoo's choice was simple. It was a way to avoid alarming people if he had returned looking older and weathered from his battles. Seeing the man's composure and lack of surprise, Jinwoo knew this wasn't an ordinary civilian. Recognizing the title of Envoy of the Rulers, Jinwoo acknowledged the man's purpose, anticipating that he hadn't simply come to welcome him back. He sensed that the rulers had a message for him, one that would require a private, uninterrupted conversation. Agreeing to hear him out, Jinwoo suggested a more relaxed setting he had in mind. Together they walked down the street and entered an ice cream parlor nearby. Inside the quiet ice cream shop, Jinwoo's unexpected choice of venue caught the envoy slightly off guard. Jinwoo, however, explained his simple reasoning. After enduring a world of endless darkness and emptiness, the desire for something as ordinary as a sweet treat felt natural. The envoy, ever polite, began by offering the ruler's usual thanks. But Jinwoo, cutting through the formalities, sensed there was more to the visit and pressed the envoy to speak plainly. The envoy disclosed that all threats had been resolved, yet the rulers had concerns. Jinwoo's power, immense and world-altering, was a force beyond what Earth was ready to handle. To the rulers, a solution seemed necessary. They offered Jinwoo the option of relocating to another world, one that could handle the presence of his abilities. Jinwoo, however, knew this suggestion carried a deeper motive. He calmly proposed another option, sealing him away entirely. His tone sharpened as he questioned the envoy, suspecting the ruler simply wanted him gone now that his role was fulfilled. Though Jinwoo maintained a faint smile, a cold glint in his eyes revealed his distrust. Caught off guard, the envoy hurriedly clarified. He wasn't there to eliminate Jinwoo, but to address a new development. Quickly, the envoy handed his phone to Jinwoo, showing an article that had recently sparked fear across America. The headline spoke of a prophecy claiming that the god of death would descend upon Earth with a vast army of death. The envoy explained that Selner, a fortune teller of modest power before Jinwoo's vanishing, had grown immensely in influence after coming into contact with the energy of the ruler's world. As Jinwoo listened, he realized the weight of his presence extended even to this realm. Exhaustion evident in his gaze, Jinwoo expressed a quiet wish to postpone the conversation. Respectfully, the envoy bowed, acknowledging his decision, and departed, leaving Jinwoo alone in the tranquil ice cream shop. Surrounded by the quiet hum of normal life, Jinwoo found himself contemplating his place in the world. As he reflected, he considered a concept that had long lingered in his mind. Every being has a purpose, a reason for existing. Jinwoo, who had once become the Shadow Monarch wielding immense power to stop the invading monarchs and restore balance to the world, had undoubtedly fulfilled his own mission. Yet with his purpose completed, his vast strength now seemed burdensome, lingering like a force that no longer belonged. He compared it to spent nuclear fuel, powerful yet perilous without a purpose. He wondered if, like an entity that had reached the end of its need, he would become unnecessary in this peaceful world. The thought felt hollow, almost painful, and it weighed heavily on him. Just then, Jinwoo sensed something, a familiar presence outside. Driven by a sudden urge, he quickly moved to the doorway, searching for confirmation of what he felt. He looked out to see a young woman in a tracksuit pausing mid-run, seemingly caught by the enticing scent drifting from the shop. For a moment, she glanced back, noticing the ice cream cream shop and the boy standing at its entrance. She shrugged, then continued her run, unaware of the warmth her presence had stirred in him. As Jinwoo watched the figure fade into the distance, he realized that there were still people in this world he deeply cared for. People who meant everything to him. There were memories, connections, bonds that held him here. Some born from the past, others yet to be made. And that reason was enough. With renewed purpose, Jinwoo resolved to stay, to embrace whatever lay ahead. One by one, he would uncover countless reasons to remain in this world that had always been his home. Thanks for watching. Like, share, and subscribe if you enjoyed it. Until next time, happy watching.